January 1944. High above occupied Europe. The air is thin and metallic cold. A B-17 flying. Fortress drifts through shattered clouds at over 20,000 feet. Its aluminum skin is scorched black. The wind screams through a place where metal, glass, and guns once stood. The entire nose of the aircraft is gone, ripped away by flak in a single violent second. There is no windshield, no insulation, no protection, only open sky. Inside the cockpit, the temperature plunges far below freezing. Oxygen masks strain against frozen faces. The pilot's boots are braced against the deck, not for comfort, but to stay anchored. In front of them, where instruments should be sealed behind armor and glass, bare control cables thrash in the open air, vibrating like exposed nerves. The bomber is still flying. For 10 minutes, this aircraft remains airborne, held together by airflow, damaged hydraulics, and the discipline of a crew trained to endure the impossible. Below them lies enemy territory. Ahead, if they can reach it, is the long route home. This moment did not begin here. It was forged by years of escalation, strategy, and sacrifice set in motion long before the flak found its mark. By the winter of 1943-1944, the air war over Europe had reached a brutal maturity. What began as a theory of precision bombing had hardened into a daily contest of attrition. High above the continent, fleets of American heavy bombers pushed deeper into German-controlled airspace than ever before. Their objective was industrial paralysis. Their cost was measured in aluminum, fuel, and lives. The aircraft at the center of this story belonged to the United States Army Air Forces, specifically the 8th Air Force, the spearhead of America's daylight bombing campaign. Flying out of cold, muddy airfields in eastern England, these crews were tasked with striking factories, rail yards, oil facilities, and aircraft plants across the Reich. Daylight bombing was deliberate. It was meant to be accurate. It was meant to be decisive. It was also extraordinarily dangerous. Unlike British night bombers, American crews flew in full view of enemy defenses. German radar tracked their approach. Fighters climbed to meet them. Anti-aircraft batteries, thousands of them, waited beneath the bomber streams. Flak did not need precision. It only needed proximity. By late 1943, loss rates were catastrophic. Entire crews vanished over targets like Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and Bremen. The 8th Air Force suffered weeks where 1 in 10 bombers failed to return. The sky itself had become a killing zone. Yet the missions continued. The backbone of this effort was the Boeing B-17, flying fortress of four-engine, heavy bomber designed to survive damage no aircraft should endure. It carried up to 13.50 caliber machine guns, layered defensive armor, and redundant systems, meant to keep it flying even when wounded. But design could only go so far. German defenses adapted quickly. Fighters attacked from head-on angles, exploiting the relative vulnerability of the bomber's nose. Flak gunners adjusted fuse timings to burst shells at formation altitude. Steel fragments scythed through aluminum skins at nearly the speed of sound. A single flak burst could do everything or nothing. It could tear a wing apart. It could kill a crewman instantly, or it could leave an aircraft grotesquely damaged yet still airborne. The men who flew these missions were not reckless. Most were barely in their 20s. Pilots, navigators, bombardiers, radio operators, gunners, each role critical, each position exposed in its own way. They trained for emergency procedures obsessively. Engine fires, hydraulic failures, wounded crewmates, but there was no checklist for losing the entire nose of an aircraft. That section of the B-17 was more than a compartment. It housed the bombardier, the navigator, critical instruments, the forward gun position, and the aircraft's most exposed glazing. Removing it meant removing structure, balance, and protection in a single instant. Still, the doctrine was clear. If the bomber could fly, it must try to return, because every aircraft brought back meant experience preserved. Every crew saved meant another mission was flown, and every mission flown tightened the pressure on a Germany already straining under blockade and bombardment. The stage for this incident was not an isolated sortie. It was one flight in a vast, grinding campaign, one that demanded endurance not just from machines, but from the men inside them. And as the bomber streams formed over England and turned east toward the continent, the risks they carried were fully understood, if never fully controllable. Those risks would soon become violently real. By early 1944, the air war had entered a decisive phase. The Allied leadership understood that the coming invasion of Western Europe would depend on air supremacy. German fighter production, fuel refining, and transportation networks had to be crippled before ground forces ever crossed the channel. That pressure fell squarely on the bomber crews of the 8th Air Force. Missions were planned with mechanical precision. Crews rose before dawn. Briefing rooms filled with cigarette smoke and low voices, as red yarn traced routes across wall-sized maps. Targets were revealed at the last moment, often deep inside Germany. Flak concentrations were marked with grim familiarity. Estimated fighter opposition was discussed clinically. No one spoke about fear, but everyone understood the odds. A standard B-17 mission could last 8 to 10 hours. Crews flew in tight combat box formations, aircraft separated by only a few dozen yards. This spacing was essential. Overlapping fields of fire were the bomber's primary defense. Stray from formation, and an aircraft became a solitary target. The Luftwaffe exploited this relentlessly. German fighter pilots learned to attack head, closing at combined speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. In those seconds, the nose of the B-17 became the focal point of violence. Plexiglass shattered. Forward guns jammed or were blown apart. Navigators and bombardiers absorbed the brunt of the impactofen, with no armor between them and incoming fire. Below, anti-aircraft batteries waited. The most feared weapon was the 88mm flak gun, fast-firing and deadly at bomber altitudes. Shells were timed to explode near formations, filling the air with jagged steel fragments. Unlike fighters, flak did not pursue. It is saturated. Crews described flying through black clouds that pulsed and bloomed around them, each burst capable of catastrophic damage. By this stage of the war, German flak belts around major targets were dense and disciplined. Cities, factories, and rail hubs were ringed with hundreds of guns. Fire control radar improved accuracy even through cloud cover. The bomber streams could see the bursts before reaching them dark. Slow blossoms marking the danger ahead, and then they flew into it. Inside the aircraft, noise was constant. Engines roared at full power. Intercoms crackled. Oxygen masks hissed rhythmically. Temperatures inside the unpressurized fuselage dropped to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Frost formed on flight suits. Metal burned bare skin. Every crew member had a defined task, and failure in one position affected all others. The navigator plotted by dead reckoning and celestial fixes. The bombardier controlled the aircraft during the final bomb run. The pilot and co-pilot held formation under fire. Gunners scanned sectors relentlessly, knowing that a moment's inattention could be fatal. What made nose damage especially dangerous was structural reality. The forward fuselage was not just a workspace, it was a load-bearing section. Remove it, and the airflow changed violently. Control cables, normally shielded within the airframe, could be exposed to freezing temperatures and buffing wind. Instrument panels could be torn away. The aerodynamic balance of the aircraft could shift unpredictably. Many bombers that suffered severe nose damage did not remain controllable. Some snapped apart. Some entered unrecoverable dives. Some simply vanished from formation, falling silently toward the ground. And yet, doctrine did not change. Crews were instructed to maintain altitude, hold formation as long as possible, and complete the bomb run, even if damaged. Turning back early risked isolation. Dropping bombs prematurely endangered friendly forces and civilians. Only after bombs were released could survival truly become the priority. It was within this unforgiving environment, this intersection of strategy, machinery, and human endurance, that the incident of the missing nose occurred, not as an anomaly, but as an extreme outcome of a system pushed to its limits. The moment of impact would arrive without warning, and what followed would test every assumption about what a bomber and its crew could endure. Inside a B-17, survival was collective. No crewman flew alone. Each man's safety depended on the others doing their jobs under conditions that steadily eroded physical and mental endurance. The nose of the aircraft was the most exposed position of all. The bombardier and navigator sat behind thin plexiglass, inches from open sky. Long before any damage occurred, when that nose was torn away, their world ceased to be enclosed. Wind rushed through the aircraft with hurricane force. Temperatures plummeted instantly. Anything not secured was ripped out: maps, notebooks, equipment, even personal effects. Oxygen hoses stiffened. Breath crystallized mid-air. Communication became hand signals and shouted fragments over the intercom. The pilots, only a few feet behind, were suddenly flying an aircraft with part of its body missing. Their instruments might still work, but the sensation was visceral. The aircraft vibrated differently. Control response changed. The sense of exposure was absolute. Fear was not abstract. It was immediate and physical. And yet, the procedure remained. Hands stayed on throttles. Eyes stayed on gauges. Formation spacing was maintained not because it was safe, but because discipline was all that remained between control and chaos. No heroics, no panic, just trained response under extraordinary conditions. From a tactical perspective, a bomber with catastrophic damage was a liability. If it fell out of formation, it became a magnet for fighters. German pilots were trained to finish off stragglers. A crippled B-17 could expect immediate attention if enemy aircraft were nearby. Maintaining position was not bravery, was concealment within mass. Flak. Damage created a cruel paradox. The more severe the damage, the more essential it was to remain predictable. Sudden maneuvers risked structural failure. Gradual course corrections risked separation. The safest option was often to continue straight and level, even while wounded. For 10 minutes or more, that meant trusting that no further hits would arrive. That meant flying through the same hostile airspace that had already nearly destroyed the aircraft. The B-17's reputation for toughness was not myth. Redundant control systems, multiple engines, and robust wing structures allowed many aircraft to survive damage that would have doomed lighter bombers. Control cables were often doubled. Engines could be feathered. Fuel could be rerouted, but the aircraft was never designed to fly without its nose. The exposed control cables now faced direct airflow at altitude. Ice formation was a real threat. If cables froze or snapped, the aircraft would become uncontrollable. The pilots had to apply steady, minimal inputs. Too much force could worsen oscillations. What kept the aircraft airborne was not a single system, but a fragile equilibrium, speed, altitude, trim, and constant adjustment. This was not flying in the traditional sense. It was managing a falling machine that had not yet decided to fall. These angles, human endurance, tactical necessity, and technological limits intersected inside that open cockpit. Each second in the air was borrowed time, and all of it led toward the moment when the situation would either stabilize or collapse entirely. In moments like this, command was not dramatic. There were no speeches, no raised voices, no visible authority. Leadership, in a crippled bomber, manifested as restraint. The aircraft commander pilot in the left seat had to make decisions with incomplete information. The nose was gone. The forward cruise condition might be unknown. Instruments could be unreliable. Structural integrity was uncertain. Yet every choice had cascading consequences. Turn too sharply, and the weakened airframe might shear. Descend too quickly, and the formation would be lost. Climb, and engines already stressed by cold and damage might fail. The decision was usually simple and brutally narrow. Keep flying straight, keep the aircraft stable, and delay every irreversible choice for as long as possible. The co-pilot's role became critical. He monitored engine behavior, fuel pressure, and airspeed, freeing the pilot to focus on control. Communication was minimal but precise. Each word mattered. Each correction was deliberate. Leadership here was not about boldness. It was about patience. Holding a damaged aircraft in the air demanded trust in the machine, in the crew, and in the thin margin between survivable damage and sudden loss. From the ground, German flak crews never saw the aftermath of their work. They saw formations approach. They fired by calculation and radar cue. Bursts were observed, adjusted, and repeated. A hit was measured by a bomber, leaving formation, trailing smoke, or disappearing into clouds. A B-17, continuing onward, even visibly damaged, was not remarkable. To fighter pilots, however, damage told a story. Head-on attacks were designed to maximize impact in the shortest possible time. Closing speeds left little room for maneuver. A burst of cannon fire, or a near-miss flak detonation, could remove an entire section of an aircraft before the pilot even registered success. But once contact was broken, the fighter pilot often moved on. Formation density mattered. Fuel mattered. Survival mattered. A bomber still flying straight, still holding altitude, still embedded in the stream was less tempting than a straggler already falling behind. The crew with the missing nose survived those 10 minutes partly because they did not look like prey, yet their discipline masked their vulnerability. There was an unspoken understanding among bomber crews. Everyone knew the aircraft could fail at any moment. Everyone knew that bailout was an option. It wasn't. With the nose gone, parachuting became complicated. The airflow alone could kill a man exiting the aircraft. Frozen hands struggled with harness clips. Oxygen deprivation crept in silently. Decisions had to be timed perfectly. And yet, abandoning the aircraft too early carried its own weight. Bailout over enemy territory meant capture or worse. Staying with the aircraft, even as it flew wounded, preserved the possibility of reaching friendly lines. That hope anchored men to their positions, long after instinct urged escape. No one wanted to be the first to say it was over, so they endured the cold, the noise, the exposure. They trusted that the next minute would still be survivable. These layered pressures command decisions, enemy behavior, and moral calculus converged. As the bomber pressed onward, the aircraft was still aloft. The crew was still functioning, but the moment that would define everything was approaching. What happened next would decide whether this flight ended as a footnote, or as one of the most extraordinary survivals of the air war. The impact came without warning. A sudden concussion tore through the forward fuselage, not a direct hit, but close enough. A heavy flak shell detonated just ahead of the aircraft's path. The blast wave struck first, then the fragments followed. In a fraction of a second, the entire nose of the B-17 was peeled away. Plexiglass disintegrated. Metal framing twisted and vanished into the slipstream. The bombardier's compartment ceased to exist as a defined space. Where there had been structure, there was now only roaring sky. The aircraft lurched for an instant. The bomber's balance faltered as air rushed violently into the open fuselage. The pilots felt it immediately, pressure on the controls, a sudden change in pitch. Loose objects were ripped forward and out. Ice crystals formed instantly on exposed surfaces. The navigator and bombardier were gone from their stations, forced backward by the blast. Stunned but alive, they clung to the aircraft's interior by instinct more than intention. The pilots reacted without conscious thought. Throttles were ease-not cut. Control inputs were softened. Rudder trim was adjusted in fractions, not movements. The goal was not recovery. It was stabilized. The bomber did not break apart. It did not dive. It continued forward. Those first seconds mattered more than anything that followed. A sharp correction might have overloaded the weakened airframe. Panic could have translated directly into loss of control. Instead, the aircraft settled into an uneasy equilibrium. Wind howled through the cockpit at hurricane force. Temperatures plunged. The men could no longer hear the engines properly feel their vibration through the airframe. Control cables now exposed, violently but held. The pilots kept their eyes on the artificial horizon. The altimeter needle wavered, then steadied. Airspeed remained just above stall margin. Formation aircraft slid past on either side, their crews staring in disbelief at the missing nose. And still, no fighters appeared. For nearly 10 minutes, the bomber flew like this, open to the sky, balanced on the edge of aerodynamic possibility. Every second passed was a second earned. Every vibration was a question without an answer. Inside the aircraft, no one spoke unless necessary. Oxygen masks iced over, hands numbed, faces burned with cold. Yet tasks continued: monitoring engines, checking systems, confirming that no further failures were cascading unseen. This was the turning point. Either the aircraft would fail, hear over enemy territory, or it would remain intact long enough to escape the most lethal zone of the mission. As the flak clouds began to thin and the formation edged away from the target area, the crew realized something extraordinary. They were still alive, and the aircraft was still flying. But survival was not secured yet. What lay ahead, distance, weather, and the long return across hostile airspace, would test the limits of endurance even further. As the bomber pressed onward, the immediate violence faded, but danger did not. With the target behind them, the formation began its long, vulnerable turn toward home. This phase of the mission was often deadlier than the bomb run itself. Damaged aircraft lagged, fuel states dropped, fighters hunted for weakness. Inside the open cockpit, time distorted. The crew could no longer feel minutes passing, only exposure. Wind battered their bodies relentlessly. Ice crept along instrument casings. Every breath through the oxygen mask burned the lungs. The pilots' faces were numb, their eyes watering uncontrollably in the freezing slipstream. Yet, the bomber held. The 10 minutes after the nose was torn away were not dramatic in motion, but they were decisive in consequence. This was the window in which control cables either froze or didn't, in which structural vibration either amplified into failure or dampened into survivable rhythm. The pilots made one critical decision. They descended slowly. Not a dive, not a break from formation. A gradual reduction in altitude that increased air density and marginally reduced the violence of airflow through the cockpit. It was a calculated risk. Descending too fast could overstress damaged sections. Descending too little left them in a lethal cold. The engines responded. The airframe remained intact. Crew members crawled forward enough to assess the damage. What they saw defied belief. The aircraft's nose was not damaged. It was gone. Jagged metal edges framed the open sky. Control lines were visible, vibrating but intact. No blood froze the floor. No bodies had been lost overboard. That realization changed everything. With confirmation that the aircraft was still structurally viable, priorities shifted from immediate survival to long-term endurance. The bomber eased further from formation, but not enough to invite attack. Other aircraft are subtly adjusted, providing cover without breaking cohesion. No German fighters arrived. Luck played a role, but discipline played a larger one. Hours later, after crossing back over friendly territory, the bomber began its final descent. Ground crews below watched in disbelief as the aircraft approached its forward section torn away. Crew exposed to the elements. Landing a B-17 was already a delicate process. Landing one with radically altered aerodynamics was a test of restraint. The pilots kept airspeed high enough to avoid stall, then eased the aircraft down onto the runway. The wheels touched, the bomber rolled, and it stopped. Engines were cut. Silence rushed in. Only then did the crew truly register what they had survived. The 10 minutes flying with a missing nose had not been a miracle. It was the product of training, machine design, restraint under pressure, and the refusal to surrender control while control still existed. But survival did not end the story. What followed the reckoning, the records and the meaning assigned to this flight would shape how such moments were remembered long after the war moved on. When the engines finally fell silent, the aircraft no longer looked like a weapon of war. It looked like wreckage that had somehow landed intact. Ground crews approached cautiously. They had seen damaged bombers before: burned wings, shredded tails, collapsed landing gear. But this was different. The forward third of the aircraft was simply missing. No nose cone, no glass, no framing beyond jagged aluminum. Edges bent backward by airflow. The cockpit had been open to the sky for miles. Maintenance crews climbed aboard and immediately understood how narrow the margin had been. Control cables were intact, but scarred. Hydraulic lines showed signs of freezing. Instrument wiring dangled loose, having survived only because airflow had not torn it free. Official damage assessments categorized the aircraft as beyond economical repair. It would not fly again. The airframe was written off and stripped for usable components. Another bomber would replace it on the flight line within days. The crew, however, was alive. Medical officers treated frostbite, oxygen deprivation symptoms, and shock. No one had been killed by the blast that removed the nose. That fact alone bordered on statistical impossibility. In many similar incidents, forward crewmen were either killed instantly or lost to the slipstream. The incident spread quickly across the base, not as rumor but as evidence that the aircraft could endure more than engineers had ever predicted. Evidence that training mattered. Evidence that discipline under pressure could extend survival beyond reasonable expectation. Command reports noted the incident in measured language. There were no embellishments, no dramatic phrasing, just dates, damage descriptions, and outcomes. The event did not alter strategy. It did not change doctrine, but it did affect morale. For crews scheduled to fly the next morning, the sight of that bomber mattered. It stood as a physical reminder that survival was not purely theoretical, that even catastrophic damage did not automatically mean death at the same time. It reinforced a harder truth. If an aircraft could lose its nose and still fly, then the enemy could inflict almost unimaginable violence and still fail to stop the mission. The air war was grinding forward, indifferent to individual outcomes. And while this crew survived, many others did not. The larger picture pressed in quickly. New targets were assigned. New aircraft filled the hub. The machinery of war absorbed the incident and moved on. Yet, for those who witnessed it firsthand, the image lingered. An aircraft that should have fallen from the sky taxiing to a stop under its own power. What that meant, beyond the technical and tactical, would only become clear with time. Within days, the aircraft was gone. Its remains were dismantled methodically. Sections of usable aluminum were salvaged. Engines were inspected and reassigned. Instruments were catalogued. The open skeletal cockpit that had carried men home through freezing sky was reduced to parts. Then memory. The crew returned to duty status after medical clearance. There was no formal ceremony. No medals issued solely for surviving. In the calculus of wartime record-keeping, endurance was expected. What mattered was that the aircraft had returned. The crew was intact, and the mission's results had been recorded by early 1944. Survival stories existed alongside casualty lists of staggering scale. The 8th Air Force continued to lose thousands of airmen each month. even as escort fighters extended deeper into Germany and attrition slowly shifted in the Allies' favor. Bomber losses remained severe. For every extraordinary survival, there were dozens of silent absences. Yet, these incidents carried weight beyond statistics. Engineering teams studied damage reports carefully. Each account informed incremental improvements, better insulation, revised oxygen systems, reinforced control routing. The lessons were not dramatic, but they were cumulative. Survivability increased, not through miracles, but through attention to detail. Psychologically, the effect was more complex. Crews understood that survival was unpredictable. Training could extend the margin, but chance still ruled the final outcome. The story of a bomber flying 10 minutes with its nose missing did not create false confidence. It created grim respect for the machine, for the men who flew it, and for the thinness of the line separating endurance from loss. As the spring of 1944 unfolded, the air campaign intensified. Oil refineries burned. Rail networks fractured. German fighter production faltered under sustained pressure. By the time Allied forces landed in Normandy, air superiority had been won at extraordinary cost. This single aircraft did not change the war, but it embodied it. A war where machines were pushed beyond design limits, where humans were asked to endure conditions never meant for survival, where success was often measured not in victory but in returning it all. In the end, the incident faded into operational history. It was referenced in technical notes, remembered in fragments by those who saw it, and eventually folded into the broader narrative of strategic bombing. But its meaning remained, because wars are not only shaped by decisive battles, they are also shaped by moments when the impossible does not happen, when something that should fail does not. That understanding carried forward into how the air war was remembered, and it leads us, finally, to the quieter question of what this survival truly represents. The story of the B-17 that flew without its nose is not a story of defiance. It is a story of limits. Limits tested not by intention, but by circumstance. By a war that demanded aircraft fly higher, farther, and under greater punishment than any generation had faced before. By crews trained not for heroism, but for procedure, taught to hold control, maintain discipline, and delay surrender to chaos for as long as physics allowed. What kept that aircraft in the air was not courage alone. It was engineering that assumed damage would occur, training that assumed fear would arrive, leadership that understood restraint mattered more than force. The 10 minutes spent flying with exposed control cables and open sky were not dramatic in the way cinema often imagines war. They were quiet, violent in sensation, but restrained in action. Men doing exactly what they had been trained to do, no more, no less, while the machine decided whether it would hold together. This is how much of the air war unfolded. Not in sweeping gestures, but in sustained endurance. Not in singular moments of triumph, but in repeated confrontations with failure that did not quite arrive. The B-17 did not survive because it was invincible. It survived because it was just resilient enough, and because the men inside it respected its fragility. In that respect, the aircraft becomes a symbol not of indestructibility, but of balance. Between design and chance, between control and acceptance, between the desire to survive and the discipline to keep flying. When historians speak of strategic bombing, they count tonnage dropped, factories destroyed, and missions flown. But embedded within those numbers are moments like this, one unrecorded in headlines, but essential to understanding what the war demanded. An aircraft should have fallen from the sky. It did not. And in that narrow gap between expectation and reality, we glimpse the true cost of war, not only in loss, but in the extraordinary strain placed on those who were asked to endure it.